Okay, I hit record. All right, so hi class. We're going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of you just looking at me lecturing all by myself in my bedroom, we're going to have a guest today, a wonderful guest, a very old friend of mine and a colleague. And her name is Professor Myisha Priest, and she's at NYU. Would you like to introduce sort of what work you do?
I would. Hi, class. Even though I can't see you, I can tell that you're there. I teach at the Gallatin School at NYU, and it's an interdisciplinary program where students they create their own majors. They're called concentrations. And so that demands a lot of creativity on the part of the students and also on our part as faculty. So I teach African American literature and culture, but I teach it in ways that I would never teach it elsewhere. We don't have, things like English 1A or 1B. We just don't have them. So I know it's very strange. So I teach, for example, I teach a class called The Politics of Food, which is thinking about how race, class, and gender can be read through American food culture, starting in the antebellum period. Right now, I'm teaching a class called Imagining Justice, which is an interdisciplinary examination of ways that American culture has thought about who the subjects of justice are. And we begin with the Declaration of Independence, which of course is a very important and formal, sort of beginning for thinking about these questions. But we read everything from, like, last week we looked at Elbow Room, Schoolhouse Rock. So it's truly, if some of you may remember that, but I may be dating myself and potentially Holly by talking about Schoolhouse Rock, but it's a truly
Introduction.
yes. But it's a truly interdisciplinary approach to thinking about African American literature and culture, and that I find very enlivening and exciting. So that's what I do.
So there's no English 1A, 1B. It's in the context of the study.
Isn't that crazy? It's so well. Of course, there's English 1A and 1B in the English department, but over in the Gallatin School, we don't have. They have two. They have a Gallatin writing seminar and a Gallatin interdisciplinary seminar, which is designed to help them learn to think interdisciplinarily and understand that that isn't placing three or four things next to each other or even two. It's finding some kind of intersection,
Mhm.
and that's it. Then they have then they go through class for their years, their 3 years, and then they have final capstone requirements that enable them to show that they made some kind of coherent sense out of their 4 years.
Mhm.
But it's a pretty free form program, which is why there's so much faculty oversight. Uh,
Mhm.
and we mentor them, and we have advisees, and there are all these ways in which we're supposed to help them, be really responsible about their approach to fields and disciplines, even though they're not situated right in any of them in particular.
That's really neat. And one thing that stands out is that it's student centered, right? They can develop their own projects. I'm My classes, people can do anything they want for their projects. They can do websites, they can do podcasts, they can do video essays. Like I have opened up to any kind of electronic media, and I think it's exciting. It's exciting for me. I've had people do an app. I had someone develop an app to trace Holden Caulfield's New York City, and it's a tour. It's a geo tour, and you go to the sites and you interact and you learn about Holden Caulfield. So it's very technology is very cool, and we're in an interesting time to really figure out these tools and what they can do for the students. So today we're going to talk about passing a little bit. I thought it would be more fun to have a little dialogue about passing than to just sort of give a top-down lecture. So I actually reread this 2 days ago, um, and well, here's the thing. I love this novel. I absolutely love this novel. I love Quicksand, Larsen's other novel. I love Passing just because I think it is so complicated, and this is in the context of a women in lit course. I feel like I don't like either of the main characters. It's like I love this novel, but I really don't like the women at the center of this novel. How do you feel about these women, Irene and Claire? What's your take on these?
You know, I guess as all of us have experienced, when you read a book at different times, it reads differently, and in some ways, it reads you. So I struggled with Eileen this time. I felt the her allegiance to these kind of social forms and to what she calls security to be very cowardly and I felt angry about it in ways that I hadn't before. But I also did feel I felt I think the sort of crisis ridden time in which we are sitting helped me see them more sympathetically in a way.
Yeah.
So I guess I saw them both. I was sad for both of them because I felt like they were both differently destroyed by an encounter with power, which is different than thinking about them as blameworthy. So I had very mixed feelings. I did feel a lot differently than I have normally. The way that I have thought about this piece and sat with it over time felt really different this time. But
I, I
I was attracted to Claire more than I normally am. I was more admiring of the quality of having that keeps getting mentioned in the piece
Mhm.
as something that if you're an artist and you have that ruthless quality of being committed to your work, then often you can produce really amazing work. And historically speaking, your life will be narrated as a successful one because you were committed to your work. Even if you like slept on a park bench and hurt everybody in your life and did all these wild things, it was all in the service of your art. It's just that Claire didn't have that form. So
I
I was more sympathetic toward her.
actually this time I know what you mean. I used to like Irene a lot more. She's so obsessed with doing the right thing. I mean, I always thought she was a bit pathologically OCD, right? She wants everything just such a box, like the box and how it looks is so important to her. But I always assumed the novel meant for me to identify with her in
Yeah.
terms of her commitment to the Black family, commitment to the community, right? And I always saw Claire as a vampire, right? Literally, like the red lips that she has, and she seems to want to. She's one of those vamp spirits, right? That wants to suck the life out of Irene because she wants access to a community she left behind. And I always thought that was incredibly strange. And then I always thought it was strange that she had such an effect on Irene. Why does Claire bother Irene so very much? It's beyond her choices. It's like she has like this personal um, what she's personally unglued every time Claire comes into her life. This time reading it, I felt sorry for Brian. I felt, and I never liked him before, but I was like, he's got these two women, and it's almost like it almost taps into the old Madonna whore division. Do you know what I mean? Where Irene is like Mother Supreme and Claire is like the whore, right? And Irene is obsessed with the idea that Brian might be having an affair with Claire, which I never believed. My students actually thought so. Yeah, do you think so? Do you think he's
Oh my goodness. When she tumbled down into the abyss, I was like, oh no. Yes, I did. I felt like if not in fact, I think there's a moment where she speculates or doesn't want to speculate about whether they've consummated their affair. But yes, I think his heart went to Claire.
you think so?
I do. And that was if whatever, I mean, I think she shared with him his deep dream. Remember that dream that Irene keeps battling against, that he wants to go to Brazil? And he
Right.
wants to go
It's
to
for Brazil.
Brazil because he's heard that it's raceless, that race doesn't matter there, it doesn't hold you back there. And the only ally he has in that quest is Claire because Irene doesn't share that quest.
Irene actually loathes that quest.
Mhm.
She's so one of the moments that I find poignant is when Brian is talking about his work and how much he hates the work and how much he hates his patients.
Yeah.
And I've always been very disturbed by that moment. It just seems that Irene is uh, I don't mind that he's not completely happy, but it seems like he loathes the community in a really disturbing way. Am I off on that?
No, didn't you feel? I mean, I think that you mentioned quicksand um, also, and I think that that's one thing that this pair of pieces share. I always find it interesting that they're almost always paired, but that there's definitely a loathing along with a longing for blackness or black communities.
Right.
And but he had mostly loathing, right? I think his longing was could have only been functional or non-lethal from afar. Perhaps if he had made it to Brazil and escaped being black, then he would have longed for whatever he felt was good about blackness. But he was a he it was something he couldn't find value in, and found, you know, the material circumstances that blackness produced disgusted him.
Yeah,
So
I find that really disturbing. And I guess then the attraction for Claire, not only does she understand that dream, but she has deserted the Black community. But you're right. Then she just wants to participate, and it's she's not really participating. I don't know, where are we supposed to be in this novel? Whom are we supposed to feel has made the greatest sacrifice, I guess?
that's such a great question, because I think, don't you think it's very um, time bound, that answer? I think reading it in 1929 when Larsen published it, the lines would be drawn in a much different way than they are now, potentially. Um, we had mentioned before we jumped on to the recording that you know, that there had been recent episodes or instances, public instances of passing, um,
Yes.
and so these questions are circulating in our own time in really weird ways. Although these two people we were talking about were passing for black, but if you think about it, if you think about the careers of you know, singers like Mary J. Blige or even Jessica Alba, though I don't know if her comeback is going to happen, or even someone like Beyonce, and the way that they, if you look at their kind of, you know, their play with aesthetics at the beginning of their careers, it was very focused on asserting a kind of blackness that
Hmm.
that was legible to a mainstream audience. And as they became more popular and it was clear they would be bigger stars, they became what we would call whiter. So I think, so having said that, going back to your question of where we should land with these characters, I think our time brings those questions forward in a really different way than they would have during the Harlem Renaissance. I think during the Harlem Renaissance, there was more of there was certainly an awareness that people were passing out of Black life, right? There was the Black migrations had been happening. People were finding out that there were ways, both politically, socially, but also through these kinds of what we would consider secret or personal or individual or intimate forms of leaving some of the hardships of Black life behind. There was a well known um, process in place during the Harlem Renaissance through which people were passing out of the Black world.
Hmm.
Um, but there was also a lot of desire for what Blackness represented in American culture, which is why you hear all of the stories about people in New York City from, you know, Lower Manhattan and Midtown traveling uptown, and there are songs, "Let's take the A train." You know, everybody wanted to go to Harlem. You know, if you weren't going to Harlem, then you weren't going anywhere. And
Right.
there was a huge desire for what Blackness represented, which is different than the desire to be Black. So I
Right.
think that their take on passing would have encompassed a different sort of social setting, a social setting so different that these instances, the ways in which these characters relate to their sort of racial identity would read very differently. So I think we would, you know, our frustration with Irene this particular time around would not be, I mean, Irene was a race woman, and
Right.
that was an extremely important and well respected position to hold during the Harlem
Right.
Renaissance.
In fact, I've always thought it very bold that Larson represented Irene as so unhappy in her commitment.
Hmm. And so problematic. That's the same thing with I don't know why I can't remember her first name. Her last name is Gray. Anne Gray in Quicksand. Those of you who've read the twin set of novels will remember that these Larson depicts these race women very unsympathetically.
Yeah.
She's very interested in having us see what is vacant and bankrupt about that allegiance.
Bankrupt is a really, really good word for her, because it's like she is so obsessed with appearances that her soul seems incredibly empty. It's all about appearance. I was rereading the Judith Butler piece on the question of how gender and race play out in this novel and how they can be recognized. And she spent a lot of time, Butler spends a lot of time talking about the moment where Claire's husband finds her at the party. I can't think of his name. I think I've repressed his name.
Yeah, it's important to forget about him. I think it's John Bello, though.
That's right. That's right. She talks about Bello as his sort of blustering whatever, but he can only read based on community, based on sort of context. And that's how he kind of reads race. And of course, he was he's supposed to be a total jerk. We get that. But that's a really weird moment because in the moment it's read, it's also erased at the same time. So it's like they're on the verge, but recognitions don't really happen because you don't know what they mean. There's no denouement there. It just kind of disappears in that scene. So Butler was saying that it's a very good example of how gender and race intertwine, and it's all about the performance of these things. And I think Irene she falls into that. She's performing Blackness. She's performing this Black community. And so I feel like Larsen really took a bold step by representing her that way.
Absolutely. I think that's really true. I think that's an important way to think about it because it was seen certainly during the Harlem Renaissance. These categories of white and black were seen as much more solid and unquestionable than we might think of them now. And so she was at pains to have a conversation that really wasn't being had, which is this isn't real. Like, let's understand that we're all in a field of interaction with this um, structure that has enormous importance, but that isn't real in a certain way. And so, she was in the minority in wanting to explore that kind of unreality, that precariousness or fragility. And so, Claire passing back and forth with ease was, in some ways, anathema, because that's the other. Um, there are a whole set of, if we could say that the genre of passing stories is defined by certain things, one of them is the certain tragedy, which Claire does meet, of the person who passes, right? That must be punished. That must be stopped. We can't really have stories in which the person passes and that's a happy ending. Because
Right.
then what would that mean? Well, that would mean that these boundaries really are permeable and you can really exceed or escape them. So the person who's passing has to be punished. There were also and some of the punishment included death. There were other forms of punishment, especially for women, which usually included having this black baby. Like, like, oh no,
Right.
there were all
And
these
that's her big fear is that if she has another baby,
kind of
sort of
come out black.
it'll be so Black that she won't be able to pass. But there's also this really weird way that she doesn't even really like her daughter
Yeah.
because it's evidence of that fear and guilt and her decision. uh like, okay, it worked out, but it's not a person to me. It was just evidence that I'm using. There's no connection to the daughter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was interesting that you were talking about Butler because I hadn't actually thought of that piece. So I was thinking about um, Munoz's disidentification
Mhm.
and his sense that it's certainly that racial identification is a form of performance, and that although with very lived consequences, very real material lived consequences, but that I mean that's why he calls it disidentification, right? It's always a failed or um, unsettled performance. It's always in jeopardy of failing. And I thought that the daughter was just Claire's sort of, like you said, she embodied that. Um, Claire could never escape that what her daughter meant and what meaning her daughter held, and so she always destabilized her performance, whether she was passing for black or passing for white.
Right. This, I guess, so what I want to know is why is Irene so shaken up by Claire's existence? And the second part of that question is she's always shaken up by her existence when she's not there. But then when she enters the scene, Irene immediately is attracted to her,
Mm-hmm.
right? The narrative perspective makes me attracted to her. She's always so incredibly beautiful, right? She's always just life of the party. So, why does she unsettle Irene so much? And then why does she, every time she's there, is completely swept away by her charm?
Don't you find that interesting? I mean, I think we are meant to be attracted to Claire because it's not just that she's incredibly beautiful and incredibly stylish. I mean, she has the frocks and the hats and the beads, and those things are important. But it's also her eyes and her quality, like her shoulders, her quality of her bearing, I guess you might say, in a different time. And especially her eyes as this, which is a whole interesting thing, right? I mean, we could just pause there, but as this place where you could see but not see her Negro-ness, right, which is also connected to a kind of soulfulness. So I think, I mean, I felt like Claire was a constant disruption to the protective boundaries that Irene wanted to insist were inviolate. Uh, but that Claire's presence, moving in and out of those boundaries, made it obvious that they were not. They were easily violated and easily permeable.
Mhm.
But that also, I mean, and this is something we wondered about before we started recording too. I mean, we're not the only ones who desire Claire. Irene does. Everybody does, right? She's that person in the room that everybody wants. So, and that includes Irene. So I think that she speaks very blandly about her quote unquote marriage bed. It's not a site of passion or um, erotic charge, but
Mhm.
but her experiences with Irene are exactly that. And so all of that erotic energy that is foreclosed by Irene's desire to stay safe, to have Brian function in that way within her life, seems to open back up when Claire comes in the room. I mean, it's desire, it's sexual desire, it's erotic, it's the most charged erotic set of interactions in the book.
I always thought of it as Irene is so deeply repressed. She's
Mhm.
repressed expressing herself and her and any kind of inner being only because she has been subsumed by doing race work, right? That is her commitment, and she's so into the social sort of propriety of that. So I always figured Claire represented her sort of everything that she's repressed, maybe including the fact that those boundaries are fragile, permeable, and maybe not even incredibly desirable, right? But when they first meet, Irene is passing too,
And
right? For a cup of tea.
yeah.
And she has this whole thing about feeling faint on the street from all the crowds, right? So I don't know. I feel like there's something really wrong with Irene and her perspective on Blackness. Do you know what I mean?
I do, but I think she's exemplary of a certain set of the moment. That's again one of those things that maybe is not missed, but maybe is muted in translation. That there was a whole, I mean, there were all of these conversations taking place through the lens of sociology and um, especially sociology. If you think about someone like Du Bois, thinking about what was worthy in the quote unquote Negro and what was worth keeping and what was worth leaving behind, right? That's one of the things that he undertakes to examine in um, Souls of Black Folk. He says these are the Negro's gifts to the world, and he
Right.
outlines them in great detail. And that's with the recognition that all of these other parts of the Negro need to be left behind.
Right, right.
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 So on some way, on some level, Irene is the embodiment of a larger conversation or tug of war that was taking place in Harlem and other places where people were discovering that there were other ways to be Black, but and then there had been in the Black Southern past, but that there were all kinds of things about Black people that Black people themselves didn't want to bring forward, right? And so, but I also think um, that those questions are riddled with questions about what is civilized, what is savage. And so it places Irene in this very um, unlikable position because she wants what is seen as civilized, what is seen as refined, and all things Black that put those goals in question are to her anathema. I don't know. I think Irene is someone we can't view with the kind of sympathy with which she would have been viewed in 1929.
I think so
People would have,
too.
yeah, people would have seen her and known that she was doing a kind of, for lack of a better word, missionary work on behalf of Black folk.
Right. No, well, she presents herself as a missionary. She even tries to censor information that her husband can give to the boys. And I feel like the fact that she has two boys and Claire has a girl is important too, because Irene has accepted and stands for patriarchy, basically a kind of family model, right? Can you say something about sort of, let's just say Irene does desire Claire. I think that's true. I think she has erotic desire for Claire. And it's definitely not clear that she has a lot of erotic desire for Brian. She just wants him. He's like a prop, right? He is my family prop. And she said she wants to control him, basically, and the boys. So, I mean, and I am trying to give her some sympathy, some 1929 vibe.
Let
And
her have it. Let her have it.
but yeah, and maybe I'm horrified by Irene too, because I recognize a little of myself in her, because I like to engineer the family's lives and make sure everything's smooth functioning. So I get it. Whereas Claire is so, um, what's the word? Not as she crosses boundaries, but she just exemplifies the attractiveness of just being pure desire. She desires Black folk. She desires white folk. She desires, parties. She's just pure desire, free floating in the text, right? Which is attractive. But, Irene participates so incredibly strongly in uplift, right? It would have been called sort of uplift. Uh, and I like Larsen. I like Hurston as well, because I think their works are a whole lot more complicated, especially in terms of women and women's voices and women's relationships. But in 1929, putting these women at the center of the text, both they're like doppelgangers. They look the same. They both are passing in the first scene, and then they sort of go in these different directions. What would that have meant in 1929? Is like, would it have been like good woman, bad woman kind of comparison?
Absolutely. And I think that, Claire's echo in Quicksand is definitely a bad woman, right? She's the one who entices people and she has sex with men, and she goes into dark basements and she dances. Um, but I think, yes, Claire would have been the bad woman, um, whose tragic end we had to be on the side of in order for culture to move forward in the ways that people like Irene imagined. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, I feel like that's one of the reasons why this this text has been so enduring, because that free floating desire that Claire offers, the desire not just for her beauty and her, her style and her emotion, but the 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 possibility of escape that she represents, I think would have touched many people, if only secretly, right? I mean, that's why it was read so heavily. That's why it has, I mean, it's not just that it's endured into our time, but it's in its own time had uh it sent shockwaves. People kept reading it, people kept passing it on, people kept talking about it and thinking about it. Um so yes, bad woman, but in a very delicious way.
Yeah, she is delicious. She's like the woman everybody hates and loves to hate.
Mhm.
Um, so do you think that Irene pushed her?
I always want to know. I just feel like I don't know. I mean, she just everything that pushing her meant. She didn't want her to be. Remember, she kept saying that she couldn't be free. Like that would be dangerous to everybody involved, to everyone concerned. If Claire actually got free, so she couldn't live freely. She also couldn't continue to live in the way that she was living, passing back and forth. She also couldn't be in a Black world because that would also disrupt Irene. So I don't know if there's an alternative to thinking that Irene pushed her, or at least,
At least push the idea of
yeah,
her.
like she willed her out of that window. That's what I feel. I feel like it is. It was the wind, it was the force of her will. It wasn't her hand that sent Claire overboard. Because
Right.
I mean, there's a way in which, that scene is so interesting because he comes in and it says immediately that Claire starts backing away. As if she already knew, once this exposure or this moment of revelation happened,
Mhm.
that she finished, that she had already, sort of taken in that, or committed herself to that course of action.
Right.
So she was already, maybe they all understood that she couldn't go on, that for their lives to continue as they felt was most safe and secure, she she would have to be destroyed. Though I don't necessarily think of her as someone who's very self-sacrificing. So that's one of the reasons why I don't really feel like it's easy to say that she jumped or fell, that she leaned, in the parlance of 1929, that she leaned out of the window.
Right.
I think her her having quality, her desire to, what is she told Irene, I'm dangerous. Don't love me, I'll hurt anybody, I'll do anything to stay alive
Right.
and have the life that I
I
want.
guess she's honest about who she is.
But that's not someone who's going to commit suicide just because someone found out they were black.
No. In fact, I kind of got the feeling by then she wanted him to know.
Or she didn't care. It was Irene who cared that about that aftermath, right?
But yeah, and Irene, I mean, what I noticed rereading it this time was so many moments where Irene is fed up with her commitment to race and the fact that she seems to be debating a communal versus individual identification a lot of times. And keeping Claire's secret comes down to this individual commitment, which is against the communal commitment that she holds sacred. So I almost feel like Irene is the one torn apart at the end. Claire,
Oh yeah.
like, you know what I mean? Claire is always going to be Claire. It almost is like she had to fly out that window because she can't be fixed in a boundary. And I also think she couldn't, not only could she not live that life, but I think she wanted revelation. I think she sought revelation. And revelation for her means disappearing because, her identity was the free floating desire. But I feel like Irene is the one who's almost unconscious at the end, right? She doesn't know if she pushed her. She's just kind of confused at that point, and I feel like it's her sort of her questioning individuality versus community. That kind of primal question is what tore her apart. That's what I feel like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Claire was, I think, a particularly wrenching um, figure in that conversation, specifically because you said that she sided with her for individual reasons, which I think is absolutely true. But I also think she didn't tell because she considered Claire to be another black woman, which is going back to this question of her collective loyalty.
Right.
So she embodied both of those things, and and that's sort of impossible, that's an impossible embodiment. So holding them together or trying to hold them together tore them apart. But I think she, I mean, you mentioned that I think it was this class was thinking about, you disappeared. Am I there?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
you're gone. I can see an avatar, a red-haired avatar.
Oh, that's Kim Possible.
But there you are. I was like, okay, I'm looking into the eyes of that avatar. Um, but there's a way in which Irene reminds me of. I mean, her end reminds me of the end of the awakening. This kind of confusing dissolution of a person that leaves you with all of these questions. I mean, you do understand that in some way, well, in a very literal way, that, you know, um, their lives are over, but they're also, it's a strange and kind of nebulous falling apart.
Right. And they
Which,
just wrote The Awakening, so that's a perfect reference. It's not like she commits suicide. She just stops.
Mhm.
And yeah, the same thing here. I feel like Irene, the passive voice, I guess. She's like wondering if she pushed her. Like, really? Yeah, and like you said, it was her will that pushed her, right? She willfully wants to restore these boundaries, but the fact that Claire is gone now, in a weird way, the thing that floats across boundaries is also the thing that makes visible those boundaries.
right, of course.
So her sort of disappearing out the window is both the thing that crosses boundaries is now gone, but that doesn't mean the boundaries are going to be in place because partly they were in place because she crossed
Right.
back and forth.
Yeah. And I think that's one reason why, that's why it bears thinking about the fact that that's where the novel ends. I mean, like everything else in this work, this is the novelist's choice. I mean, she's constructing a story. She's engaging in the active representation and has chosen this moment to, or maybe who knows if she chose it. Maybe she just ran up against the brick wall that these rending questions, leave her with. But in any case, she ends this novel and it feels very, in some ways, like the questions raised by the novel just can't be resolved and we're just left there. Whereas
Right.
I think Edna's end doesn't feel so irresolute. It feels like she met her end in a different way that isn't necessarily without its coherence. But I think that the end of passing just is, everything is just broken and on the ground, like Claire.
Yeah, that's totally how I feel. And I've often imagined alternative endings. Like I think the first time I read it, I assumed that Claire would be exposed and not care. That's kind of what I thought. I thought she would embrace her blackness and be like, you know what? You've always been a jerk. I don't actually like you. And there it is. Like that's one possibility. Or,
But that's the story that can never be told.
that can never be told.
Yeah. Right. There always has to be an outing. I mean, I was even thinking about the professor who was outed. She outed herself because she was going to be outed. I mean, what if it had never been known and she just continued to win prizes by writing about Black people and
Right.
and making statements? I mean, it feels like there's something culturally speaking that understands justice as a putting an end to these um, performances. But what if
Right.
we didn't tell that story?
Right.
If the person moved back and forth between these boundaries and they were fine, then what?
Right. Well, that's going to ask you because some scholars have said this is a tragic mulatto story. I don't really agree with that. Do you agree with that?
No, I think that's a very I understand that framing though because it connects Larsen's work to a lineage of works that are proposing or engaging these questions.
Right.
Yes, I understand that framing in that way, but no, I think she's doing something much more complicated and in some ways much more demanding. Because the thing about the tragic mulatto stories is people didn't feel, and even when you read them now, you don't feel the ambiguity that we feel. You feel like what happened was not just foreordained, but it has a rightness about it.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it feels like, you know what I mean? It feels,
Feels like she just tossed everything in the air.
yeah, and exactly. And it's, the novel, you close the book at that moment when everything is still in the air. And I think that that's different than the tragic mulatto tales, which were designed to reinscribe in a very neat way and close, not just for the character, but for us as readers to provide us with a certain stable, like a universe of stable understanding about what race meant and what it could be and what it could do. And
Right.
this doesn't give us that at all.
Right. Much like Hurston, I wanted to do Their Eyes Were Watching God, but we ran short on time. So what we're doing is the short story Drenched in Light. Do you know that story?
Not, well, it's been years since I read Drenched in Light.
I was working on it this summer. Um, I did a proposal. There's a collection on dismantling the adult child division and separation in African American literature. So I proposed doing a paper on how Little Red Riding Hood works in that story
Mm.
because Isis, the main character, steals a red tablecloth and goes out into the community and dances and then winds up frightened and going into the forest and then sort of saved by a white couple. And that is similar to me to the Larsen complexity because the ending of that story is so ambiguous. It's so weird. It's so ominous, but the child is so joyful. She uses this white couple against her grandmother and shuts up her grandmother. And it's really, really loaded and complicated. And I've also tried to imagine it in its time. I think it was 1921 or 22, that story. I'm like, what are you doing here? I don't know what you're doing here. So I was working on that all summer. I feel like the endings of these stories, basically all of these sort of feminist works, kind of open up a space for these questions, repressions, desires, what it means to be a woman in this social context. And then they have no answer. So they just create an ending that doesn't really solve anything that was going on in the story. You know, that's how I feel about Drenched in Light, too. So it sounds like you agree.
I do, but I guess I want to even push it a little further and not say that they don't have answers, but to say that they're exemplifying or laying bare that we don't have answers, culturally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
They're leaving us at that moment, not just because there's a kind of into what they can do creatively, but because culturally we have not at any point really passed that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it's more than um, them not knowing what to do. It's a way of thinking about American culture as having never taken whatever work is required to have our stories end beyond this moment, right? I mean, it's not, I think it's bigger than what they were not able to do. I think they don't, sure, they're not able to create different endings for their characters, but I think if they had in some way, they would have to imagine with completely different tools. I mean, they'd have to imagine in ways that would render their stories illegible in American culture because we
Right.
ourselves don't have the tools to imagine these stories. So I don't know. I think it's both the kind of intimate work of creating that brought them, these particular ends, but I also think it's a question of what's allowed by the forms and by the epistemes of our culture.
Um, and while I have you, I wanted to mention we are ending the class with Kindred.
Oh, wow.
Are
That's
you a,
exciting.
yeah, are you a fan? Well, I wanted to do something contemporary, and the funny thing is, my daughter had to read Kindred for high school, and I've read it before and I loved it. I had someone do an independent study on it, and so it just bopped in my mind, like let's end the course with Kindred, having started with Jacobs, and then there can be some sort of reflection back. So, are you a fan of Kindred? Do you like it?
I love it. I love it. I think it's incredibly disturbing, and no matter how many times you read it, you want her to be able to do something different. You want Dana to be able to intervene in a different way in the pasts of her ancestors.
It's kind of disturbing how acclimated she gets over time. And I've always wondered, right? So it's the main character is going back in time into slavery and experiencing it firsthand. Students haven't read it yet, but I've always wondered because she's married to a white guy and he's kind of sometimes, what's the word, infantilizing of her,
Mhm.
and definitely has more power than her. And I've often wondered, what could you read that story as basically she's imagining it and that she really is a victim of abuse and that she's in her mind connecting it up with history, because she's getting like beaten throughout this text and everybody thinks it's him. You know what I mean? I've wondered, like, could this possibly be that she really is being beaten? I don't know.
I always thought I thought that's really interesting because I've always thought that it was important for us to see the violence as also having presence in the present.
Yeah,
That right. I mean, I don't want to say too much because some of your students haven't read it yet, and
right.
it's just a great read. So it's important for you not to know things in advance because I enjoy that process. But there are also these weird echoes where Kevin's face fades into Rufus's and back and forth, or where she can't tell
Right.
which one she's with.
Right.
Um, and I've always thought that it wasn't so much that Kevin was beating her in some kind of explicit way, but that because because of the way that race has worked and been an unresolved crisis in American culture, that violence was present in their relationship as well, whether he
Right.
was actually beating her or not. Like there's just a way in which Butler presumes that the violence from the past is unended and has traveled. Well, it already was in the present, but is now, you know,
Right.
it's pronounced in a particular way because she went to the past.
That's because that's my read on him too, that he's definitely problematic. and that right, whether he's actually beating her, but that the choice she has made to marry him is almost self-mutilation, right? It's also distanced her from her community, from her family, right? There's a lot about how no one will welcome them.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's what my daughter wound up writing a paper about how Dana is detached from the Black community in her present circumstance, and that winds up being the major problem when she goes back in time is that she doesn't have community. It's both her position and also her foreignness in every way. So I don't know. I just wanted to ask you that before we ended, whether that story might actually be, you know, reflect on contemporary culture in a way that I think the students will see. And I'm hoping it'll yield some good projects and they'll reflect on sort of contemporary issues as they read that. It's a wonderful read. I'm glad you liked it. I also really like Bloodchild, Butler's short story Bloodchild. So I'm having them look at that too, just because students always they don't know what to do with it. It's a pregnant man story. They think it's really crazy, and so that's where we're ending.
Yes, that story reminds me of you for that reason because it's a pregnant man story, but it's so focused on like the devastating impact of pregnancy on the body that's bearing, and it's so gory and like creepy and gross, and it's very much like about a parasitic. It's just such a gross story, you know. It brings up it's like, but all of these like underlying fears that shadow our sense of what you know of pregnancy's beauty and you're bringing a baby into the world. You know, there's a shadow to that that authors and artists have tried to talk about in many ways, and she's just done it in this way that has a very deep,
This
creepy. Yeah.
pregnancy I think is a core issue of the awakening. They just finished the awakening, and I tried to make that point there too. That Madame Ratignolle's pregnancy, growing throughout the text, right, is like the shadow, right? It's the thing that is sort of a destiny that's why Edna's in the position she's in, right? I find it interesting that in Kindred, she's not a mother, but she's moving to the suburbs in that moment. And there's all this really interesting stuff about what that means. It reminded me of Irene in terms of she's moving to the suburbs. Her husband wants her to type his manuscript, like these little kinds of, and that his study's all nice and she's not even really writing anymore.
And he wants her to organize his books. I know that got you. I was like, oh no.
Oh,
No.
no, that's like, honey, pack my bags. Oh, no,
Exactly.
we don't do these things. Right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that we've done a pretty good job, and hopefully, for all the students, I hope that this models kind of dialogue. We can't have that at the moment in the classroom, but I thought it would be more engaging for you to see how we talk about books. Myisha and I went to graduate school together 20 years ago.
Don't say it.
And we used to do this all the time. This was kind of how we spent our time. So we hope you have enjoyed it. Any last words? You want to say goodbye, class? Or
Oh no, I hope that I love the trajectory you've set up. So I'm, you know, I can't, I hate, I'm really looking forward to, hopefully I'll hear how it goes arriving at Kindred and having to consider issues as a kind of arc.
that's what I'm hoping. We
I
start
think,
with Jacobs, and I think Jacobs and Kindred are like the bookends of this class, and they're kind of doing similar work, I think.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's sort of the idea, and hopefully some really good projects will come out of it. I'm hoping that they look at contemporary events and things going on, and that the class sort of uh, teaches them how to talk about things and how to situate things and how to sort of look at archival things that just won't die.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let
Thank you
me.
for having me. Thank you, Holly, for having me, and class for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It was delightful. Let me stop the recording and then we can chat a little bit. Okay.